The day was bright and lively outside the Grand Royal Palace, a popular tourist destination known for its stunning architecture and the unwavering presence of the royal guards. These guards, dressed in their immaculate uniforms and towering hats, were an attraction on their own. People admired their discipline and stoic demeanor, often challenging themselves to make the guards smile or move. It was a game that many found amusing, but everyone knew it was just for fun and never meant to cross a line. Jacob, a young tourist visiting the palace for the first time, had a different idea in mind. He wasn't interested in simply taking pictures or marveling at the grandeur of the place like everyone else. No, Jacob had a plan. He wanted to create a viral moment, something that would make him famous online. His friends were already recording everything, laughing and joking as they roamed the palace grounds. Jacob noticed one particular guard standing near the gates. The guard was tall and imposing, his uniform spotless and perfect. He didn't move a muscle, his gaze fixed straight ahead. To Jacob, this wasn't a display of respect and discipline. It was a challenge. "I bet I can make him react," Jacob whispered to his friends, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. His friends looked at him with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Don't do anything crazy," one of them warned. But Jacob wasn't listening. He pulled out a cup of bright orange juice from his bag, holding it in one hand while gesturing to his friends to keep filming. "This is going to be hilarious," Jacob said confidently, ignoring the growing crowd around him. The tourists nearby were already taking notice of his antics, some shaking their heads, others whispering to one another. Jacob slowly walked toward the guard, pretending to admire the palace as if he was just another tourist. The tension in the air was palpable, with people watching closely to see what he was up to. Some hoped he would stop. Others couldn't help but wait to see what would happen next. As Jacob got closer to the guard, his heart raced with excitement. He was just a few steps away now, the guard's towering presence casting a shadow over him. Still, the guard didn't move, his expression as calm and focused as ever. Jacob smirked, feeling invincible. "He won't do anything," Jacob thought to himself, convinced that the guard's discipline would keep him from reacting. Finally, Jacob stood directly in front of the guard. He held up his cup of orange juice as if he were offering a toast, his friends giggling nervously in the background. The other tourists began to murmur, their eyes fixed on Jacob. Without hesitation, he tipped the cup forward, spilling the bright liquid onto the guard's pristine uniform. Gasps filled the air as the crowd froze in disbelief. Some immediately pulled out their phones to capture the moment, while others turned away, unwilling to watch what might happen next. Jacob laughed loudly, turning back to his friends as if he had just pulled off the prank of the century. The guard, however, remained perfectly still, his composure unbroken, but something in his gaze shifted ever so slightly. It was clear that this was far from over. The crowd was silent for a moment after Jacob splashed the orange juice on the royal guard. The bright liquid trickled down the guard's immaculate uniform, staining the fabric and pooling near his polished boots. Everyone held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Jacob, on the other hand, was grinning, feeling triumphant, as if he had just won some unspoken challenge. He turned to his friends, spreading his arms as if asking for applause. "Did you see that?" "He didn't even move," Jacob said loudly, his laughter echoing across the courtyard. His friends exchanged nervous glances, their earlier amusement now fading into unease. One of them whispered, "Jacob, I think you've gone too far this time." But Jacob shrugged off the warning, completely convinced that the guard's strict training meant he would do nothing. To him, this was just harmless fun, a silly moment to make people laugh. The other tourists, however, didn't find it funny. Some looked on in shock, while others whispered angrily about Jacob's disrespectful behavior. A mother covered her child's eyes, leading them away from the scene, while an older man shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Jacob was too busy basking in his own excitement to notice the growing disapproval around him. As Jacob continued to laugh and boast about his achievement, the guard remained in his position, motionless. His face was a picture of calm, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if Jacob didn't exist. The silence from the guard only seemed to fuel Jacob's arrogance. "See, I told you they can't react," he said to his friends, now emboldened by what he believed was his success. He turned back to the guard, waving a hand in front of his face mockingly. "Come on, aren't you going to say something?" Jacob teased, his voice dripping with confidence. But then, something unexpected happened. The guard's steady gaze shifted ever so slightly, locking directly onto Jacob's face. It was such a small movement that most of the crowd didn't notice it, but Jacob did. His grin faltered for a moment, and he took a tiny step back, unsure of what to make of it. The guard didn't speak or move any further, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet authority that made Jacob feel smaller than he had a moment ago. Before Jacob could process the situation, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Step away from the guard immediately," a stern security officer said, walking quickly toward Jacob. The officer's tone was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. Jacob froze, his confidence now replaced with a flicker of doubt. The officer, dressed in a crisp uniform, stopped a few feet away, looking directly at Jacob with a serious expression. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer asked, his voice low but commanding. Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crowd began to murmur again, their attention now focused on the unfolding confrontation. The tourists who had been silently judging Jacob now watched with anticipation, some even pulling out their phones to record the incident. Jacob's friends tried to blend into the background, pretending they weren't involved, but it was clear that they were just as uncomfortable as Jacob. The officer glanced at the guard, who still hadn't moved a muscle, and then back at Jacob. "Do you understand the disrespect you've just shown?" the officer asked, his voice filled with disappointment. Jacob stammered, "It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." But his excuses sounded weak, even to himself. The officer's expression didn't soften. "This is not a joke," he said firmly. "You've crossed a line." The weight of the situation finally started to sink in for Jacob. The laughter and thrill he had felt moments ago were gone, replaced by a growing sense of embarrassment and regret. The officer's unwavering stance and the disapproving murmurs of the crowd made it clear that this was no longer a game. Jacob swallowed hard, realizing that the consequences of his actions might be more serious than he had anticipated. Jacob stood frozen, the stern gaze of the security officer piercing through his earlier confidence. The laughter and thrill from moments ago now felt like a distant memory. His heart pounded as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He glanced nervously at the crowd that had gathered around him, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. He wanted to say something clever, something to diffuse the tension, but nothing came to mind. His mind was blank, and his bravado had evaporated. The security officer stepped closer, his calm yet authoritative demeanor making Jacob feel even smaller. "Do you realize what you've done?" the officer asked, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about splashing some juice. You've disrespected an institution that represents centuries of tradition and discipline. These guards are here to protect and uphold a legacy, not to be treated as a source of amusement." Jacob's face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words got caught in his throat. "I didn't mean any harm," he finally stammered, his voice barely audible. The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Not meaning harm doesn't excuse your actions," he replied. "There's a difference between innocent fun and outright disrespect." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jacob's friends, who had been quietly standing behind him, began to edge away, as if trying to distance themselves from the unfolding drama. Jacob noticed their retreat and felt a pang of anger and betrayal, but he knew he couldn't blame them. After all, he had brought this upon himself. The officer gestured to the royal guard, who stood motionless despite the orange stains on his uniform. "Do you know how much discipline and commitment it takes to stand there?" day after day, representing the crown. And yet, you decided it would be funny to humiliate him in front of a crowd. The officer's tone grew sharper, and Jacob felt his shame deepen. A few feet away, an older tourist spoke up, addressing the crowd. "This young man needs to learn some respect. These guards dedicate their lives to their duties. It's not a joke." Several others nodded in agreement, their voices adding to the chorus of disapproval. Jacob felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, and for the first time, he regretted his actions in a way that felt real and heavy. The officer took a step back, his sharp eyes never leaving Jacob. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You will apologize to this guard, right now, in front of everyone. Then you will accompany me to security, where we will discuss the consequences of your actions." Jacob's stomach sank at the mention of consequences. He had been so focused on making a viral moment that he hadn't considered what might come after. Turning to the guard, Jacob hesitated. The guard's steady gaze met his own, and for a moment, Jacob thought he saw a flicker of something in the guard's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or a quiet dignity that made Jacob feel even worse. Taking a deep breath, Jacob mumbled, "I'm sorry." His voice was shaky, and the words felt insufficient, but they were all he could manage. "Louder," the officer instructed. Jacob cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet the guard's eyes again. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said, his voice louder this time. "It was wrong, and I shouldn't have done it." The crowd watched silently, their judgment still palpable. The guard remained still, not acknowledging the apology in any visible way, but Jacob knew the damage was done. The officer motioned for Jacob to follow him, and as they walked away from the scene, Jacob could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into his back. He had wanted attention, and now he had it, but not in the way he had hoped. Jacob walked behind the security officer, his head hanging low as they made their way to a quiet room near the palace grounds. The noise of the crowd faded, but the weight of their disapproving gazes still lingered in his mind. He could feel his face burning with embarrassment, and for the first time, the gravity of his actions truly hit him. This wasn't just a silly prank anymore. It was a mistake that had spiraled far beyond what he had anticipated. The officer led him into a modest, well-kept room where another official was waiting. This second officer, an older man with a calm yet authoritative presence, gestured for Jacob to take a seat. Jacob obeyed, his legs feeling weak as he sank into the chair. The two officers exchanged a brief glance before the older one spoke. "Do you understand why you're here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Jacob nodded, his throat dry. I was just trying to have some fun," he muttered, his words barely audible. The older officer leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Fun at someone else's expense is not harmless," he said, "especially when that someone is a royal guard performing his duty with honor and discipline." Jacob squirmed in his seat, wishing he could disappear. He had no clever excuses left, no jokes to lighten the mood. All he could do was listen as the officer continued. "The royal guard is not just a ceremonial figure. Their role represents centuries of tradition and service to this country. What you did was disrespectful, not only to the guard, but to the values and history he stands for." The words stung, and Jacob felt a lump forming in his throat. He had always thought of the guards as part of the spectacle, a tourist attraction meant to entertain visitors. He had never considered the deeper significance of their presence or the discipline required to perform their duties. Now, sitting in that room, he realized how wrong he had been. The younger officer, who had escorted him, spoke up. "Do you know how many people admire the guards? How many children look up to them as symbols of strength and pride? And you treated him like a joke. Tell me, was it worth it? Did you get the reaction you wanted?" His words were sharp, and Jacob winced. "No," Jacob admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "It wasn't worth it. I wasn't thinking." The older officer studied Jacob for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It's good that you're starting to reflect on your actions," he said finally. "But words alone aren't enough. Actions have consequences, and you need to take responsibility for yours. Jacob nodded, feeling a mix of shame and guilt. "I'll do whatever I need to make this right," he said earnestly. The officers exchanged another glance. Then the older one spoke again. "First, you'll write a formal apology to the guard and the institution he represents. We'll review it before it's sent. Second, you'll attend a session about the history and significance of the Royal Guards. If you're going to visit a place like this, you should understand what it stands for." Jacob felt a wave of relief. He had expected worse, maybe a fine or legal trouble. But the thought of facing the guard again, even in writing, made his stomach twist. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're lucky this is a learning opportunity for you," the older officer said. "Some people don't get that chance. Don't waste it." Jacob nodded again, promising himself he wouldn't take it lightly. As he left the room, escorted by the younger officer, Jacob felt a mix of emotions. He was ashamed of what he had done, but also grateful for the chance to make amends. For the first time, he saw the palace grounds not as a backdrop for a joke, but as a place of deep history and meaning. And he vowed to never forget the lesson he had learned that day. The next day, Jacob stood outside the royal palace again, this time with a very different purpose. He held a handwritten apology letter in his hand, carefully reviewed and approved by the palace security team. The letter expressed his regret, not just for his actions, but for the disrespect he had shown to the guard and the institution. His heart pounded as he walked toward the designated meeting point. This wasn't going to be easy, but he knew it was necessary. A member of the palace staff greeted him and led him to a private area near the guards' quarters. Jacob felt his palms grow sweaty as he realized he was about to face the very guard he had splashed with orange juice. He rehearsed what he wanted to say in his mind, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. He had made a mistake, and now it was time to own up to it. When the guard entered the room, Jacob immediately recognized him. His uniform was spotless once again, his posture upright and composed. The sight of him reminded Jacob of the moment he had caused so much embarrassment, not just for himself, but for the guard, who had stood there with unwavering discipline despite the humiliation. The guard's gaze was calm, but there was an air of quiet authority that made Jacob feel small. "I want to apologize," Jacob said, his voice trembling slightly. He held out the letter with both hands, his head bowed in respect. "I wrote this to say I'm sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I know I disrespected you and everything you represent." The guard took the letter but didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied Jacob for a moment. The silence felt heavy, but Jacob stood still, resisting the urge to fidget. Finally, the guard spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Respect is not just about words. It's about understanding the value of what you've taken for granted. Do you understand now?" "Yes, I do," Jacob replied quickly. "I didn't think about what it meant, but now I understand how important it is. I'm really sorry." The guard nodded slightly and set the letter on the table. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Jacob felt a rush of relief, though he knew his journey of making amends wasn't over yet. Later that day, Jacob attended a session on the history and significance of the Royal Guards. He sat quietly as a guide explained the centuries-old traditions, the rigorous training the guards endured, and the deep respect they commanded from citizens and visitors alike. For the first time, Jacob truly appreciated the sacrifices these men and women made to uphold their duties. He realized how far removed his actions had been from the respect they deserved. When the session ended, Jacob stayed behind to thank the guide. "I never knew how much history and discipline went into this," he admitted. "I feel terrible about what I did, but I'm glad I had the chance to learn." The guide smiled kindly. "What matters is that you've learned from it and are willing to change. Not everyone gets that chance." Over the next few days, Jacob shared his experience online. Not the prank he had planned, but the lesson he had learned. He wrote about the importance of respect and understanding, urging others to think before acting. His post quickly gained attention, not for the humor he once sought, but for the humility and sincerity of his message. Jacob's journey ended with a newfound appreciation for the traditions he had once mocked. Though the memory of his mistake would always linger, he carried with him a lesson he would never forget. Respect isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing the value in others and treating them with the dignity they deserve.